All right. Okay, so the next talk is going to be by um, Josh Seltzer from Next Intelligence and a whole team of researchers, too, who contributed to this project. Let me just try to move this a little so I could get more of you. All right, that's good. Enough for now. And the talk is on asking the right questions, generating semantically and syntactically appropriate questions for deeper understanding. All right, Josh, we're ready whenever you are.
Cool. Thanks for the intro. And also thanks, Josh, for other Josh, not me, for putting this whole workshop together. All the talks so far have been super cool. And yeah, I'm looking forward to the rest. So yeah, I'm presenting on asking the right questions. And I'm, I was helped by my colleagues, Amit, Fiona, and Kathy. And as Josh said, we work at Next Intelligence, which is in Toronto, Canada. And I noticed there's been a lot of Canadian representation in the workshop so far, which is awesome. So, just to give a little bit of motivation for what we're trying to do, I chose a couple of quotes from some famous authors. So, one of them is Ursula K. Le Guin, and she said, "Words are events, they do things, change things, they transform both speaker and hearer. They feed energy back and forth and amplify it. They feed understanding or emotion back and forth and amplify it." And then one from Patricia Romney, and I quite like this one. She says, "The raising of questions, what I have called elsewhere the spirit of wonder, is a sine qua non of dialogue. Living in the questions is a good place to begin." And so the general idea is that we want to create apps and worlds which actually excite people and which respects their voice and tries to understand them and engage them. So there's been a lot of hype about sort of NLP and conversational AI for the last few years. But a lot of it has been very limited, and we really want to try to push the limit and try to sort of move into the direction of bona fide conversational AI, where we're actually engaging people. And I think there's loads of cool applications for this, even in the current context. Like, I think it'd be super cool if on Animal Crossing you were able to not just have like pre-programmed conversations with your neighbor, with the animal neighbors, but to actually speak your mind and hear what they have to think, and for them to ask you questions and engage with you. And sort of more importantly, we don't just want to automate human interactions for cost efficiency. So that's kind of a cheap shot at all the customer service chatbots. But the idea is that we want to actually engage and delight people and enter into a mutual dialogue. So there's all sorts of related work. I just chose a few key papers which I think were quite interesting. So this is a master's thesis from a student in the Netherlands called Follow-Up Question Generation. So I'm sure you can see why this would be relevant. And this paper was focusing on two components or several components belonging to semantic. So they used semantic role labeling, and then also to syntactic components, namely named entity recognition and parts of speech. And so the idea is that they get an input sentence. There's a bit of pre-processing, some tokenization, lemmatization, et cetera. And then in the deconstruction phase, the input sentence is broken down into sort of its constituent elements. And so in this example here, it's mostly consisting of parts of speech, named entities. So that could be like brands or locations or people, for example, like proper nouns. And then on the other side, into components of semantic roles. Then once you have those elements deconstructed, the reconstruction stage takes a question template and applies those different elements that constituted the input sentence, and then tries to restructure them into a question template by sort of just drag and dropping them in almost into a bunch of templates that the author pre-specified. So that's pretty cool. And then there's another paper called Fluent Response Generation for Conversational Question Answering. And this one introduces the idea or the architecture of syntactic transformers. And these are quite cool as well. So these are based on BERT. And the idea here is to be able to, based on linguistic properties, to actually be able to restructure related sentences and sort of, so in their context, they're doing it in the context of in the domain of question answering, which is quite popular. So you can see in their example, the question is, what year did the Netherlands rise up against Philip II? And a typical question answering model might give the answer, the Netherlands rose up against Philip II in 1568. using their syntactic transformers, they're able to sort of collapse that initial response into something that just feels a little bit more natural, a little bit more human. So for example, they replace the Netherlands into they because they know they can use that pronoun, so they've mapped on that pronoun. And then they also remove the against Philip II because that's sort of just implied. So that's an optional removal. So this is, I think, a very powerful technique for uh, once you've already generated a sentence, which whether it's an answer which answers the question that was posed or a question applied to a previous response, this is one technique for sort of making things feel more natural. And then one more related piece of work. So this is called deep learning based response generation using emotion feature extraction. And so this one isn't necessarily related to questions. It's more general, so it's just for responses. But I think the idea of using emotional feature extractions is very important. Going back to that quotation at the beginning, we don't just want to answer, or sorry, we don't just want to ask questions in a way that's like semantically relevant or syntactically relevant. We also want to try to amplify the emotion, to try and understand the emotion that people are putting in. So, if someone is very confused, we want to be able to understand that and try to alleviate that confusion. If someone's very excited, we want to empathize with them, etc. So the work that we're doing is going to be very similar to the follow-up question generation that I mentioned before, but we're trying to add a few more components to that, such as trying to track people's emotion and also the complexity of the responses and that sort of thing. So this is a work in progress that our team has been working on. And for now, the tentative name is just the Smart Probe model. Pretty boring. And as you can see, there's sort of four pillars. So similar to the previous paper, we're using named entity recognition. And those could be brands, those could be companies, those could be people, geographic locations, etc. And we're also using an emotion model. So this is a model trained on top of DeepMoji, which is a very fun model from MIT, which was trained on tons and tons of tweets in an unsupervised manner to associate words and semantic meaning with emojis that were in the same tweet. And then on top of that, also syntactic structure. And so this we're doing in a number of ways. And then finally, on top of that, complexity. Right now, we've just been experimenting with very, very simple proxies for complexity, like the amount of words, for example. But I think this is one particular area where we want to improve things so that we can possibly use that as a proxy for trying to understand whether a question was adequately addressed. So using this model, we did a pilot study on mTurk. So we recruited 318 Canadians and Americans to talk with our chatbot called Inca, which you can see on the right side. And this is actually a screenshot right from the pilot study. So this is an example of one of the people that completed our survey. And so you can see it asks a question about like what brands and companies have done a really good job helping their customers during COVID-19. And they mentioned Sunwing. And then our probing model picks up and asks them if this changed their overall impression of Sunwing. Then, so what we did is sort of an A/B testing approach. So we compared our smart probe model with a generic probe model. The generic probe model is what Alexandra was sort of referring to like as the I don't know problem. So this is just like a very basic control comparison where it's giving very bad stock phrases like, oh, can you give me more details or something like that? The idea being, hopefully we can improve upon that. And then we wanted to have our crowdsourced respondents actually rate the quality of our follow-up questions. So here we're reusing a metric called the sensibility and specificity average, which I think is in the next slide. And basically, after each follow-up question, we just ask the respondent, did that question make sense to you? And then if so, was it specific to your response? So these are our initial results. So over here, if you can see my mouse, we have the generic probe model, which again is just, it's always choosing from like a sample of I think 5 different stock phrases, such as, can you give me more details? Oh, I think I understand. Can you maybe share a little bit more, etc. And you'll see even for this one, the sensibleness for the generic probe is only around like 80%, which is quite surprising because you think for something as vague as, oh, can you tell me more? Everyone would just say, yeah, that makes sense. It fits the context, because it's pretty hard to think of a sentence where you would respond with, oh, can you tell me more? And that wouldn't fit. So this might just be sort of an upper bound or a result of people randomly clicking yes or no. Then the specificity is sort of more important or more relevant for us. So we're trying to create questions which are actually specific to what the respondent was talking about. And then the SSA is what I mentioned before. That's just the sensibility and sensitivity average. It's simply you add up the two and you divide by 2. And so you can see, comparing the generic probe model with our smart probe model, the sensibleness is actually a little bit lower, not too much. And then the specificity is a little bit higher. And likewise, the SSA score is a little bit higher. So the main problem, again, going back to what Alexandra was calling the I don't know problem, is that 38% of the responses that we were processing were basically too complicated for us to figure out how to respond. So that's a pretty high number. So that's what we're working on reducing. If you get rid of those, if you ignore those results, something like, and take the subset of responses which the model actually did understand, and then just look at those, then you'll see that's this like super smart probe model. Then you'll see that the SSA score is around 10% higher than the generic probe, which is not bad. Obviously, there's a lot of room for improvement. My favorite part of any of this is always looking at the failure cases. So this one I think was my favorite. So someone asked, or sorry, the bot asked, may I ask why you found talking to me better than other surveys? And the respondent replied, to be honest, this is the first time talking to you, but I felt you were very intelligent with conversational aspects. So it was lots of praise. And then our probing response to that was, could you explain why you think you were very intelligent? So here's an example of where applying the idea from the syntactic transformer probably would have helped us figure out this pronoun swapping, because of course what we should have said is, could you explain why you think I was very intelligent? And then another one, so this just sort of goes to show that all of our models and data were trained pre-pandemic. So our named entity recognition can actually pick up on Corona as an entity, but nonetheless, our bot still looks pretty stupid, because pretty much everyone in the world should know what Corona is right now, and we shouldn't need to ask people what it is. So yeah, there's a number of limitations, and we're quite excited about the next steps. So the number one thing is just increased coverage of the input sentences. So yeah, as I mentioned, I think it was 38% were tagged as basically I don't know. So we're looking into increasing our coverage so that we're able to capture a lot more. Then going back to that example with the pronoun swapping, which didn't happen, that would be a case where we can apply those concepts from the syntactic transformation and do other sort of grammatical correction. In addition, we're playing around with different ways of expressing emotion. So right now we have some very simplistic ways, but we're playing around with a few, whether it's through natural language or something maybe a little bit more subtle but fun, like a Slack style reaction. And then something possibly incorporating a knowledge base, which could have perhaps provided the AI with a little bit more information, a little bit of knowledge about what COVID or Corona is. And then aside from that, there's lots of other improvements. So there's lots of work on multi-turn dialogue, few-shot learning, and then also the problem of just detecting really good answers. Because if we ask someone an initial question and they give us a fantastic answer, it very well might be the case that that's perfectly good and we just want to move on. So it's actually quite challenging to detect when an answer is adequate, or when it sufficiently addresses the question. There is a lot of work on measuring like question answering and question answer pairs, but it's usually in the context of factual statements. So building a model that can do that at the level of opinions is a lot more difficult. And just because I think it's necessary, one bonus slide. So obviously there's a lot of hype about the generative pre-trained language models. So on the left here, you see Dialogue GPT, and on the right side is GPT-3. And so I went into the GPT-3 playground and decided to throw that response that we got before, which our AI didn't deal very well with. And the response that GPT-3 came up with is quite fantastic. So, of course, one of the big problems with these generative pre-trained models is that, in a sense, they're almost too good. So they're going to be able to come up with, they're going to be able to generate a lot of language, and it could take things into a new direction. And so one of the biggest problems is trying to figure out how to actually constrain it. So I know the OpenAI team right now is working on some sort of toxicity filter. So I'm very excited to see where that goes. But we're looking into ongoing research into trying to use these generative models, but constrain them so that they don't say anything either inappropriate or take things into a completely different topic that we don't want to, that we're not interested in probing on. Cool. So thank you for listening, and thank you again, Josh, and all the presenters. And if anyone has any non-generic questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Awesome talk, Josh. Let me just deal with the slideshow. Okay. That's weird. Yeah, you're me. So let's pan to the audience. We get a couple more people in this frame, and they're all clapping. Great. Okay, so I have a question. I'm not sure if in the final version of this you ended up using. Did you end up using like the semantic role labeler in the final pipeline?
No, so we haven't incorporated that one. So I actually just recently found out about that thesis paper in the last few days, actually. So that's something that we're going to be looking into incorporating.
Cool. So, kind of like a step even further than semantic role labels is maybe even using a semantic role labeler that can parse into FrameNet. Like I know of a couple, like one of them is called a Path LSTM, which is one that I use, and it gives SRL parses, but it also can parse into FrameNet, which like has like about 1,200 different frames for like the different types of predicates. So you could have like certain ones for eating and certain ones for sleeping. So I'm wondering if you think that would be useful, or do you think that is too structured and too granular for your approach?
Yeah, so first, I think that is an excellent suggestion. Then sort of the ongoing conflict or challenge is to try to figure out to what extent sort of over specifying things and building things into a specific structure is going to give us language and appropriate questions which actually are sort of respecting what people say and engaging with them. On the other hand, of course, if we don't do that, then it might just turn out that what we're saying is irrelevant. So yeah, that's an ongoing question, but I think your suggestion is probably very good, and that's something I'll definitely look into.
Yeah, like it would be a cool experiment even to like a bit more general than FrameNet is VerbNet, where you only have like 300 different classes for verbs or events. So it would be a cool experiment to use like parses into verb classes and then parses into frames and seeing how the system performs, and if it's just keeps getting better the more specific it is, or maybe like I don't know, it's possible that maybe VerbNet doesn't help at all either.
Yeah, so it's a good suggestion as well. I think, yeah, then it becomes also an issue of if we are sort of pre-specifying certain templates for each of these different classes of verbs, then a lot of the time, depending on the context in which that verb is being used, it may or may not be relevant and or problematic to say to the user. But yeah, the verb nut was something that we are actively exploring.
Awesome. Well, thank you for your talk, Josh. It was really interesting. It's cool hearing other people working on dialogue problems. So thanks for that talk. So next up is Dea, who's already at the podium. This is his avatar, or me playing him. Dea, can you share your screen and your presentation?
Yeah, I actually just have a question, if I may.
Oh, yeah, go for it.
I just want to go back to the emotion theory or emotion model that you've used, Josh. So theories and models on that are a bit fuzzy, and there are a few proposals there. I'm wondering if you know whether the model that you used followed a two-dimensional or two-dimensional emotional model, or for example, Polchek's wheel of emotions. I know you mentioned that there were like 9 emotions detected, or that it detects 9 emotions. So I'm wondering if you have an answer for that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I know I think we're already over, so I'll try and be quick. But yeah, so I can't remember if it was pull check, but we looked into a number of different frameworks for motions, and we found a number of them to be quite limited. So I know one of them was specifically designed for facial emotions, and then a lot of the papers in the NLP-based emotion literature were sort of just extending that framework. And we figured out that didn't really work for us because, yeah, um, there's a lot of ways of expressing emotions through language that aren't necessarily expressed the same way or expressed whatsoever with facial. Uh, so the model that we ended up coming with or are currently experimenting with, it's sort of an amalgam of a few different frameworks, and it's really just what we found worked for us in the most situations. I'm very open to looking at other frameworks and data sets. I know that there's also a limited amount of public data sets that have sort of well annotated emotional labels.
Got you. Thanks. Great talk. Thanks.
Well, thank you.